Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grazer Kokon. Let's get into the video. I said last time that we weren't going to be continuing the political theory series, but there's more things. So hopefully, as long as I don't come up with anything else, this should be the last one. I hope that you guys have enjoyed what we've made so far. As we said, in future we're going to get onto the alternative history series, but also I'm going to do a video on IQ, which should be what comes out some point this week. Definitely check out those videos and check out some of my older videos. But in the meantime, what we're going to be looking at today is the history of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic theory which we all live under today. It's quite difficult to suppose a time before capitalism because we're so used to it, it's been so ingrained within our culture, it's quite difficult to imagine a world that doesn't have capitalism. So what we're going to do, as always, we're going to look into some of the deeper history of this. So first off, what is capitalism? Well, its definition is the private ownership of the means of production. In other words, owning capital. So capital is defined as having something which is man-made, which can advance one's position in an economic sense, so it can improve one's economic performance. So the best way to think about this is like a tool, like a hammer or a machine or a weapon or whatever it is, right? Say for instance, it's back in the cave days time and you're going out hunting a woolly mammoth. If you're just there just with a wooden spear, it's not going to be as deadly as if you had a stone-tipped spear. Then it's not going to be as deadly as if you had an arrow-tipped spear, etc., etc. Trade in this sort had always existed, since the dawn of man. Different tribes trading with each other. But the thing is, that's not actually capitalism as such, because there's no profit sense in that yet, right? So I trade you something that I have that you want, and in return, I get something that you want, right? But no one's like making a kind of financial profit from that, right? And similarly, when people were in the marketplaces of like ancient Rome and all these other ancient civilizations, people would be farmers, then they would sell their product like in the marketplaces and they'd make a little bit of money, but no one ever became like fabulously rich from doing those things. For most of human history, when people were rich, it was usually as a result of them being the most powerful, the most brutal people, right? And like these people ended up like becoming like the kings and generals and aristocrats, etc., etc. And the way they got wealth was by taking wealth from other people. Capitalism is the first time where you have an economic system in which people can become wealthy not by taking things from others, but by providing goods and services to people that they want, but charged at a higher price than the actual cost of production was, right? So in that way, I sell you something that you want, and and you get something that I've sold you, and in return, you're going to give me a little bit more money than it actually cost me to do it. So I'm now incentivized to keep making you things, and you don't mind paying the extra bit of money because you're valuing the thing you get in return. So as a result of this, people are starting to get more and more wealthy. But part of the problem with this is that in in early Christian teachings, this was really discouraged. Like we're all aware of of how Jesus was in the Bible, throwing out the money lenders from the temple, talking about how it's easier for a rich man for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. This kind of very anti-rich, anti-wealth mindset really permeated throughout the whole of Christendom. As a result of this, people look down at people making money. People look down at merchants. People look down at at money lenders and stuff, right? Usury, as we've mentioned in previous videos, usury was banned amongst Christians. So again, only Jews were able to partake in that. It led to a great stagnation within Europe in a way that wasn't felt in the Islamic world. It was also a thing where pre-Renaissance Europe did not have numbers as we know them today, right? They still had Roman numerals. Now, Roman numerals are fine if you're going up to 1,000, but when you start getting more than 1,000 or a few thousand, it starts to become very complicated. So if I wanted to write the number 1,892 in Roman numerals, I'd be there for quite some time. If I wanted to do 1,000,000 470,000 or whatever, yeah, again, that would take me a really, really long time. And there'd be a whole bunch of letters and stuff, and you're like, what is this, yeah? That becomes very problematic when you're starting to deal with big numbers, when you're starting to deal with money, when you start to deal with stock, etc., etc. It's very difficult to actually have scalable kind of businesses in that time. Added also, like I said, with this early Christian doctrine, it meant that people in Europe were behind technologically, behind kind of financially, so when compared to the Muslim world, because the Muslim world used Arabic numbers, right? Or more accurately, Indo-Arabic numbers, because these actually originate in India and they became popularized kind of in the Arabic world, and that's when it started to spread to Europe. Now, these numbers were first popularized in Europe, yeah, by a famous Italian mathematician, Fibonacci. So you ever hear about Fibonacci sequences, Fibonacci patterns, etc., etc. Yeah, that's largely to do with him. He discovered these Indo-Arabic numbers by trading with Arabs throughout the Mediterranean, and by talking to them, and he realized, hold on, the numbers that they're using here are much, much better when we're dealing with money, when we're dealing with stock, when we're dealing with all these things, right? And so actually this old thing of Roman numerals, which are they're clearly outdated. They're from the time of ancient Rome, as it suggests, right? These are nowhere in comparison, kind of in terms of how good these Indo-Arabic numbers are for accounting. And actually, the father of the so-called father of accounting, which is quite a strange title to have, but anyway, the father of accounting, Luca Paciali, I believe that's how you pronounce his name. He was about in 1450, and he was really pivotal in starting the practice of bookkeeping. If you're a company, rather than just thinking, oh, if I've had money this month, then it's all good. If I have money the next month, it's bad luck. God doesn't want me to have whatever it is, right? And he was like, no, hold on, it's an exact science. You write down, it's a revolutionary idea. You write down your total expenditure and you write down your total profits, and then you work out how much money you made in that month. Mind-blowing stuff, right? But if you're not even able to do such basic maths like that, that shows you just how behind Europe was in this time. While we're on the topic of being in Italy, why did the Renaissance take off as it did? When we think about Renaissance, we think about a flurrying of art, of design, of ingenuity, of different ideas being challenged, etc., etc., right? And a kind of a rediscovery of the Greco-Roman world, of classical literature, classical everything, right? But why did this happen in northern Italy? And why hadn't it happened in Italy beforehand, or why had it not happened anywhere else in Europe? The reason for this is largely to do with decentralization of power. So if you think about the vast majority of Europe in that time were huge swathes of land owned by kings and queens, right? Or obviously mainly kings. And the Pope in Rome had his own territory called the Papal State. Everyone in Europe was kind of under the whim of either kings or the Pope. Because of that, they were able to do whatever they wanted as such, right? And so if you were a business person in that time, you were regulated, you had all sorts of restrictions, You had this centralization of authority, this lack of competition of ideas and of creativity and stuff, right? This meant that there was stagnation in most of the rest of Europe. However, in northern Italy, around the time, so you're talking the mid 15th century, you had the decentralization of these states, because these states no longer really part of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire said, it was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. It was mainly a collection of hundreds of city-states, which make up most of Germany today and other little bits within Central Europe. By breaking away from the authority of this Holy Roman Emperor, and then also breaking away from the direct authority of the papacy, it meant that actually these different city-states were able to compete with each other. So you had Florence, you had Genoa, you had Milan, you had Venice. So all of the major cities in northern Italy were all competing with each other. They were city-states. Different ones would try different things, and they would innovate in that because they're all trying to outdo each other. And so this is where you see this flurrying of ideas. One of the most famous families within this time were the Medici, or my Italian's not great, right? I believe it's the Medici family, right? Coming out of Florence. These were a family of bankers, of moneylenders, etc., etc. But they grew to such prominence that they end up essentially running the city. That's how influential they were. Now, for the first time, all of a sudden, it didn't matter whether you were king or queen. What was more important, rather than having this kind of airy-fairy kind of view of aristocracy, of nobility, etc., actually, ingenuity, entrepreneurialism, these started becoming values which started to be upheld. And then these values also spread northwards into the rest of Northern Europe. If you think as well, around this time, you had, well, a little bit later, you had, so you're talking the early 16th century, you then had the printing press, and this coincided also with the Protestant Reformation. So even more decentralization, even more breaking away from the central authority in Rome, and even more competition in terms of people having different ideas and trying out new things. So Calvin, for instance, was a very influential person within the Protestant Reformation, and he was saying he began preaching about the value of hard work, of thrift, of savings, of investment, of being entrepreneurial, right? And this was something which religious thinkers hadn't really been talking about throughout this whole Catholic period, right? The whole Catholic period, the domination of the papacy, it was a thing of actually wealth wasn't a good thing. It wasn't good to be rich. It wasn't good to be a moneylender. Now it's seen as a good thing. It's seen as a moral virtue for you to basically have good like business sense. When you start to see this in places like England, in places like Holland, in places like the Hanseatic League, so it's a collection of city-states along like the North Sea and Baltic Sea, where many different like German towns and like Dutch towns and English towns traded with each other throughout this whole region. An enormous amount of wealth end up being generated in these times. And this leads on to what was also happening at that time, which is the age of discovery. Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas, and so all the other European powers start to go to the Americas, start setting up the trading post, start trying to conquer new territory, start importing slaves, etc., etc. There was certain elements of capitalism. Even by the 12th and 13th century, you started to have people setting up what we can think of today as capitalist institutions, like stock markets, people buying funds in company, quite developed banks and stuff, as we'd understand banking today. And while you had all of this system, you still had the overarching view of economics, which was this: the world has a finite amount of wealth, and the only way that our country can become richer is by taking land, taking money from others. And so this, in the context of the age of discovery, meant that the logical conclusion was something called mercantilism. Mercantilism was basically the different European powers going, right, we need to take the wealth from here, we need to do this, we need to take that, etc., etc. And this led to lots of wars throughout the colonies and throughout Europe, as different nation states competed for different trade routes and different access to spices, access to cotton, access to sugar, etc. Throughout the 16th to the 18th century, Europe and the world as a whole was it was ripped apart by multiple different conflicts to do with this idea of we need to get money, otherwise they'll get money, and then we're going to be poor as a result of this. But is this necessarily true? Is it true that there's a finite amount of money in the world and that it's all about winner takes all kind of thing in terms of I need to take more from you in order to be richer? Not necessarily. And this is where we start to see the counter to this mindset arise from England, right? Or Britain more generally. Britain during this time, it started having colonies, it started having empires, it started having imperial dominions in the Caribbean, in the Americas as well. And through the British East India Trading Company, that's basically a private company which authorised by the Crown. And out in India, they took vast swathes of land, they had private armies, it was one of the most profitable companies in the world, right? And the Dutch also had one as well, which I believe from memory, I believe like the Dutch East India Trading Company is even to this day the most like profitable. It's like something like the largest company that's ever existed or something in terms of wealth, right? Like it was huge. But the thing is, what we have to think of is, were colonies necessarily beneficial to the home nation? Not really. Like if you look at like the actual stats on it, what you'll tend to find is that the countries themselves, yeah, right, the populations themselves bore a huge tax burden in terms of having a navy, setting up infrastructure, etc., etc. But actually, the costs were distributed like amongst the population. But the benefits of imperialism went to the tiny like kind of planter elite, the tiny like the tiny merchant elite who benefited from that, right? So they're the ones who are the slave owners. They're the ones who are the profit seekers, like kind of out in India, etc., etc. By and large, colonialism, imperialism served the interest of the few and not the many. Like never mind the actual natives and stuff, like kind of all the slaves who were the victims of it. And actually, like there's statistics on that which hopefully I'll remember to put in the comment section so you guys can look at some of the literature on it. Clearly, wealth is not being created here. Yeah, all that's happening is that the public are paying for the cost of making people who are already incredibly rich even richer, right? The nation as a whole is not necessarily becoming richer from this, and the money that the rich people are getting, they're just spending on lavish, like kind of like country homes, etc., etc. So how is it that Britain ends up becoming the richest country on earth? Part of it comes down to this, yeah, right? In the late 18th century, you had people like David Hume, like Adam Smith, right? Both Scottish economists, and what they began to realise is actually this idea of finite wealth is actually not true. That actually through industrialisation, through the division of labour, through entrepreneurialism, and through like kind of like interest and profit seeking, etc., etc., actually the size of the pie can actually expand rather than just always being the same. The way to think about it is, if we're all children and we're like all like waiting at the dinner table and there's a bit of pizza and we all go, oh right, okay, there's only this much pizza, yeah, so if I want more pizza, that means I take more slices from you, right? If, however, that pizza is always expanding, then it doesn't matter if I only take a little bit, because I'm still going to be fine and you're going to be fine. And this is actually how the economy genuinely works. As a result of this, people in Britain started to realise actually the best way for us to get money, like, and for us to like become very wealthy, is actually through trading, right? So this is where the City of London had a great advantage. So in medieval Europe, you had the feudal system, which kept peasants like tied to their land, yeah, through a system known as serfdom, right? And is a thing of, you'd end up working for your lord, yeah, and that would be it really. But the people who decided to flee from that and wanted to be like free men, all they had to do was go to the cities, yeah, and in particular cities like London, which, as we said in a previous video, they had their own like separate like laws and stuff here, which were agreed all the way back in 1066, right, saying that actually the City of London operates under different rules from the rest of the country. So if you were a business person, the City of London was the place to go. And that's why, in a disproportionate way, when compared to other like European countries, London is and always has been very central to the economy of the UK. Far more than Paris, far more than Berlin, far more than Rome, etc., right? So, and that's because people all came to London because that was a central place, and with its bit on like the River Thames, it meant that the port of the City of London, all the goods like from around the world, all the spices, all the sugar, all the cotton, all the coffee, etc., came through and went into London and went to the rest of the country and the rest of Europe. And so the merchants who were there, the traders who were there, yes, they end up benefiting from the profits that came as a byproduct of imperialism, but the real wealth was made in those exchanges, yeah, was made in the profit-seeking nature of like the London Stock Exchange. Because if one compares why Britain became wealthy as opposed to why Spain and Portugal did not become wealthy, Spain and Portugal had empires for longer. They had, at that time, bigger colonies than Britain did. They had far more slaves, like far more slaves went to places like Brazil. They never went to the Caribbean or to the Americas. And yet, Britain ended up becoming incredibly rich, while Spain and Portugal remain like relatively poor in comparison. And that's because, unlike the Spanish and the Portuguese, who just wasted a lot of their money and end up being victims of silver inflation, etc., the British and the Dutch in particular ended up becoming entrepreneurial. They end up adopting a capitalist mindset. And this is how, rather than squandering the wealth that came as a byproduct of imperialism and of colonization, it was a thing of actually they started setting up institutions which actually made the most of the wealth of the nation and of the world. This is when you start to see an explosion of wealth in these countries, and the rest of the world becoming remarkably falling behind. So this now leads on to the thing with regard to what's the argument for colonization. So pretty much most of the colonies which were gained after this time, most of the reasons why people were in favour of so-called new imperialism in the 19th century was mainly to do with the fact that they wanted prestige, they wanted national prestige. This was now the era of nationalism, and people wanted their country to have the biggest empire, to paint the most places on the map like pink or blue or whatever, right? And so it stopped kind of being really about what made economic sense, and it started to be more a thing of what makes our country look mightier, like on the world stage. But if you think about imperialism in practical sense, you're going to have to pay for a navy to patrol the waters there. You're going to have to pay an army to defend that land. You're then also going to have the army on standby in case there's any rebellions from the natives. And you're going to have to build the roads, you're going to have to build the ports, you're going to have to all these kind of things, right? And you're going to have to build the mines. And so that takes a lot of upfront investment. And as I said before, it benefits a handful of people who are in control of that process. As a result, most places most colonies, for instance, with the exception of South Africa and a handful of others, did not actually have a net profit. So when you think about the Caribbean, again, hopefully link in the description, the Caribbean, which was produced lots of the sugar and lots of the coffee, etc., actually the cost of maintaining those colonies for the Royal Navy and setting up ports and all that stuff, it was far outweighed any kind of benefit that the Treasury got from it. And you see this again within Africa. You see, with the exception of the Belgian Congo and South Africa, no other colony in the whole of Africa was a net profit for the colonizers. Especially as time goes on and the technology gap closes. When Europeans first went in, they had guns, they had medicine, they had they had far better technology than many of the natives that they were subduing. However, by the time it gets to World War One, World War Two, so even before the official period of decolonization, you start to see that actually the cost of maintaining all these things is going up, because the natives are now able to get rifles and you've got rifles. So now they're doing guerrilla campaigns, they're doing sabotage campaigns, they're doing sit-ins, they're doing protests, etc. And the cost of your colonies, the cost of maintaining your colonies is going up and up and up. The colonial powers cling on to their empires far beyond the point at which it made economic sense, because of pride, because of national prestige. Even by the end of World War One, it becomes clear that colonization is becoming unfashionable. This is why, for instance, if you compare the reaction to the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1896, and you compare it to the conquest of it in 1935, again by the Italians, the reaction is completely different. Because in the late 19th century, the different colonial powers are going, yes, we want to take this colony and take that colony and smash those natives and blah, blah, blah. By the time it gets to the 1920s, 1930s, it becomes like a laughable. It becomes like, what are you doing? It ends up being a thing where people are really disgusted now at imperialism. They've become really put off by it. And this helped, the technology from the press, etc., etc. It kind of, pictures, like radio, all these kind of things, start to really paint a picture of what it's actually like, as opposed to what people have romanticized it as being. In economic senses, it didn't make sense to have these colonies for as long as they did. However, one thing that colonization did do was allow more access to more resources throughout the world in places which it would have been relatively difficult, though not impossible, for people to have traded with anyway. It meant that people could set up rubber plantations, they could set up gold mines, etc., without the fear of people coming to invade it and taking it all from them. It's only because of the British Empire, through this kind of capitalist system, that they were able to have the wealth to build the biggest navy the world had ever seen. And as a result, you had what was known as Pax Britannica. So this is the period, throughout most of the 19th century and up until the outbreak of World War One, where the British Empire is the most powerful country on earth. Britain itself produced more economic output than any other country, more than India, more than China, etc., etc. As a result of this, it meant that it could impose its values onto the rest of the world. And in the middle of the 19th century, you had people like David Ricardo and many other economists, arguing for free trade, because having a system of mercantilism, of protectionism, of having taxes on imports, known as tariffs, of having all these different restrictions, meant that actually goods and services were not able to move across borders as freely, right? There was too many restrictions, the cost of these things were going up, etc. As a result of this, by imposing free trade on these countries, right, it meant that actually you started to have what we now know as the first era of globalization, whereby it doesn't matter where you're buying or selling goods from, whether you're the French Empire or the British Empire or the Germans or the Chinese, etc. People can get products, people can get the raw materials, people can get all the things that they need, and it can be delivered to your door wherever you are in the world. So when we think about it, it's this is the first inklings of the world that we know today, where I can order something from China and it comes here, and I can sell things to China, and the whole world is now interconnected. And this is as a result of this capitalist system. And as part of this capitalist system, we have something known as YouTube, which is owned by Google, which, as you know, owns the world, right? But I am now a tiny stakeholder in that, right? And I'm not at the point yet of monetization, or hopefully when you watch this video back in a few years' time, you'll be like, okay, cool, he was onto something. All I need from you is a like, a comment, and if you have any friends, well, I assume you have friends, share them with some friends who'd be interested in this sort of thing. It'll really help out the channel, and if enough people do that, then I can start to see some return from this. So at the moment, I'm a capitalist in a way, and I'm taking a risk, and at the moment, I put a lot of money into this project, into this YouTube channel, and I'm hoping for a profit at some point and later stage. This kind of risk taking incentivizes people to create some good material, for me to do this sort of research, for me to make videos which are hopefully entertaining, etc., etc. So all I'm asking in exchange is for a like and a comment, and maybe share it with some friends, okay? Right, because doing that will really help out the channel. In a way, I'm doing something which benefits the whole community, even though, as we discussed in the last video, even though you might say, oh, well, you're just being profit seeking, etc., etc., by me pursuing my own self-interest of wanting money, etc., etc., and wanting whatever else comes with this, right? It's a thing of hopefully you're getting something in return for it. You see? Do me a favor, like, comment, and subscribe, and share it with some friends. So now, back to the rest of the video. Now, around this time of the Industrial Revolution, which again began in Britain because of these conditions here, you end up having a situation where a lot of people were reaping the overall benefits of capitalism and living in a capitalist society, but couldn't see where this wealth was coming from, and instead focused very much on the downsides of capitalism. People living in the major cities, in particular those living in the middle classes, would be able to see from their houses very poor people living in cramped slum conditions and working in factories for long hours at very low pay relative relatively. People in those days, if you read anything from like Charles Dickens, for instance, there was this view of like capitalism is evil, like it's ruining the environment, it's ruining people's health, it's making people like poor, and it's making people desperate, and make people live in horrible living conditions, etc., etc. While all of this is true, and while in today's society, in today's world, we see slums and we see sweatshops and we see all these things around, like in particular the third world, it's quite easy to have this idea of this exploitative capitalist, right? And this person who's only looking out for profit, and he's going to do whatever it is just to make as much money as possible, and like damn be everyone else. This kind of caricature is not entirely wrong in the sense of there are some people who are a bit like that. At the same time, what Adam Smith kind of pointed out in the sense of each individual person pursuing their own thing, as long as people are not forcing other people to do things, yeah. As long as you're not as long as you don't have a metaphorical or physical gun to someone's head, people are free to go with like whoever's going to pay them the most and whoever's going to sell them the things for the cheapest cost. What people in the major cities fail to recognise is that actually, where did all these people come from? Because with industrialisation, you had an explosion of urbanisation. So what people kind of fail to recognise is that in the countryside, most people were even worse off. People in dire conditions, right? And so people fled the countryside in order to come to the city for a better life, and they got a better life. They got higher wages. They had less shorter working hours, because you think about actually being a farmer, being a tenant farmer, you're literally from sun up to sun down, you're working non-stop, right? And you're getting very little in reward for it, and the prices of your product go up and down, because there's obviously so many people who are farmers, right? And you're not going to be able to compete with someone who's more productive. During this time, you also had the agricultural revolution. So if you were a wealthy landowner, you could get the equivalent of like a tractor in those days. Wasn't exactly that, right? But you could, through more efficient farming methods, you'd be able to outcompete all the other people right around you, and so you buy up more land from them as they go out of business. People in the countryside end up being very, very poor and didn't really have much alternative. That's why they went to the cities in the first place, right? Because there was all these opportunities, and through working hard and through being thrifty and saving money, etc., etc., they could set up their own businesses, they could set up their own shops, they could set up their own market stalls, and that's how they would grow, right? If you think about companies such as Marks and Spencer's, so companies such as Tesco's, like Sainsbury's, these are clear kind of British examples. You can see that during this period, people who went from being just street sellers and stall sellers, these people ended up setting up their own businesses. You see this in Britain, you see this in America, you see people who had almost nothing all of a sudden becoming multi-millionaires, multi-billionaires. By the turn of the last century, you are at a point now where you're starting to see people who a generation before, or even at the time of their birth, would have been incredibly poor. So before capitalism, your class was incredibly important. The class you were born into was by and large the class that you would die in, right? And that was that, and it was very static, and people's best talents and their creativity and their intelligence and everything else, right, wasn't really upheld to anything, right? For instance, you have people like Mozart who, despite playing at European courts, for kings and emperors and stuff, still end up being buried in a pauper's grave, because no matter what his talent was, it wasn't he wasn't going to be paid enough in that sort of system to garner the kind of wealth that a celebrity would be getting today. Capitalism with consumer culture, right, with people having having the money to be I want to buy this, I want to pay for this, I want to pay for concert tickets, I want to pay for a bit of artwork, I want to etc., etc. All of a sudden, the creativity, the ingenuity, the entrepreneurialism, the risk-taking elements of society were now had the means by which they could actually go out there, right? The market was unleashed, right? People were free to do whatever they wanted, so long as obviously they didn't hurt other people. And as a result, the wealth of the nation increased. So it wasn't as a result of colonialism, because as we can see, Britain at the turn of the last century had the most colonies on Earth, right? It had a quarter of the world's land surface, had a quarter of the world's population. So one would think that they would still be the richest country on Earth. Instead, in the same period, America, which only very, very recently at that point had taken some colonies from the last remnants of the Spanish empires, so almost no real colonies to speak of, they end up overtaking Britain. And Germany, which in total had 5 colonies around the whole world, most of which were completely inconsequential, like no disrespect to those countries now, right? But they weren't the equivalent of South Africa, they weren't the equivalent of India, they weren't the equivalent of Australia or Canada, right? And yet, Germany also overtook Britain. Considering that Germany had only unified 30 years before that, it's quite incredible to think that actually Germany, which had previously been all these different city-states and different kingdoms and duchies, etc., now that it was all unified, now that you didn't have all this protectionism and all these barriers to trade and people going from one place to the next being able to sell things, now that all that system was completely got rid of, now all of a sudden industrialists in Berlin could trade with people in Frankfurt, right? And so you have this huge market now, right, for goods and services to be sold. And as a result, Germany very quickly industrialized and was able to sell different things, right? Same thing with America. The different competing states, where different states have different tax policies, etc., and different attitudes to labor policies and all this kind of stuff, meant that different states could compete with each other. And this is what we see even today. Tax rates in California are much higher than they are in Texas or in Nevada. And so as a result, the different states are competing with each other for these different things. Another country which is very wealthy like this, Switzerland. Again, this competition, this decentralization of different states, within a country, meaning that different cantons are able to have different tax rates. And so as a result, they're all competing with each other for who can be most attractive to business, or if they want to go in the opposite direction, then they can go in the opposite direction. But it means that businesses are free to up and leave if they so choose. And as a result of this, we end up having, globalization. We have people going, I could have a factory here in Britain where I'd have to pay workers a much higher rate, or I could close that factory down, set one up in China where I have to pay people much less, and it will be cheaper for me to do that and to ship the things back to Britain than it would to do it the other way. And who benefits from that? The consumer benefits. Standards of living in the Western world over the last 200 years have shot up tremendously, right? And every country which has had capitalism has seen huge rates of increases of wealth. We've seen poverty rates in absolute terms and in real terms plummet. We've seen 1 billion people being lifted out of poverty in the last 20 or 30 years, right? We've seen across the world, right? Every country which has got rid of restrictive systems, have got rid of government controlled systems and stuff, every country which has freed up the marketplace has seen this explosion of great wealth and prosperity, in which the vast majority of people are lifted out of poverty, right? So it's not just the very, very rich people, it's also the middle class, it's also the working class, it's also even the poorest people. The poorest people in today's society, here in the industrialized world, live better lives than kings and queens from 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, right? Because of this explosion of wealth. There's more food in the shops, there's more access to technology, even things like toilets, right? Like sanitation, everything, right? Everything is so much better in the last 200 or so years as a result of this explosion of industrialization and this explosion of entrepreneurialism and different companies competing with each other in terms of having a market to sell to customers and for customers to be able to purchase things, the best quality things at the cheapest prices, right? And so the consumer benefit, the capitalist benefit, and while this constant competition means that occasionally some people lose out, some people might lose their job, a factory might shut down here, by and large, overall, it benefits the wider society. Well, one critique of capitalism which you can't really get past is the critique levied by Marxists and levied by socialists in general, which is one of inequality. So left to its own devices, you do end up having a situation whereby the most creative people, the most talented people, the people with the highest IQ, etc., end up rising very sharply to the top, and everyone else gets, relatively speaking, left behind. So it doesn't matter that the country as a whole, a rising tide lifts all boats, because at the end of the day, this person here is thousands of times wealthier than the average person. Having this sort of inequality starts to damage the social fabric, right? It starts to create a level of animosity and contempt within people, and it leads to a breakdown in national unity. There are strong arguments for saying that actually capitalism should have some sort of regulations. The excesses of it should be regulated somewhat. What's the best way of doing that? That's what the vast majority of what politics is today talking about. It's the debate about how much the state should intervene in regulating the capitalist system. Very few people argue for completely scrapping capitalism altogether. The Soviet Union, and many communist countries, they made big arguments for these kind of things. But China today was not wealthy because it was communist, right? It's because it rejected, in the 80s, it rejected the doctrine of the previous 30 years, right? So Mao Zedong run the Chinese economy under it stagnated, and millions of people died. In the 1980s, when they started to reject these things, they started opening up their market to free trade and to capitalism, etc., etc. China now is on par, if not exceeding, the wealth of the United States. In this period of 30 years, China's gone from a very backward, underdeveloped country to one of the richest country on earth, and that is a result of capitalism. And you see in country after country now, people are going into free trade deals, people are liberalising their market. By deregulating things, by opening things up, by removing the restrictions, you're starting to see wealth pour out of these places in a way that had never been seen before. But here's another question with regard to capitalism. Does capitalism and democracy go hand in hand? So up until the rise of China, it was an assumed thing that every capitalist country was also going to be democratic. And there's the argument that every democratic society was also capitalist. By and large, the latter thing has proven to be true. For you to have a free society, you need to have free markets, but you can have free markets without having a free society. And this point was really well made by the economist Milton Friedman. So he said that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom, but not a sufficient condition. You can have, as we see in China today, a system that is not democratic at all, but where private industry is largely allowed to operate. So the assumptions that were mentioned in one of the previous videos on the end of history was made by Francis Fukuyama. When he was saying about the end of history, when he was saying about, every country is going to head more towards capitalism and more towards democracy, he was correct about the first part of it. Every country, even places like communist Cuba, are starting to head towards capitalism. But that doesn't mean that a rise of capitalism is going to necessarily lead to a more democratic society. People assumed wrongly that actually with the fall of the Soviet Union, by liberalizing the economy in China, it would lead to the explosion of democratic reforms and to liberalization. In fact, the opposite has happened. The state has used the wealth from this capitalist system to develop even more intricate systems of spying on people, of restricting people's freedoms, and on cracking down on its own population. So, if anything, China and many other places are now becoming more and more authoritarian as opposed to less. Capitalism is not a perfect system, and I think to change the quote of Winston Churchill when he was talking about democracy, he said that democracy was the worst form of government except all others which have been tried from time to time. And I think we can kind of say the same about capitalism. I think in terms of creating wealth, in terms of creating prosperity, in terms of lifting the standard of living of people, because most of human history has been a thing where people have suffered in complete poverty, right? Hunter-gatherers were not happy, they lived hard lives, they lived short lives, and it was very difficult for them to live. What we see now with capitalism is this creation of wealth and an easing up of people's lives, right? Regardless of where you are in the world, your life now, if you've lived in a country which has capitalism, your life is infinitely easier than it was for your grandparents, and in some cases for your parents, and even within the space of one's own lifetime, things have got much better, and it's noticeable how things have got better. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's without its flaws. It doesn't mean that it's not without its inequality. It doesn't mean that it's not without its own problems that it creates within itself, such as pollution, such as this and other. But At the same time, how are we going to deal, for instance, with the climate crisis? A big part of it is going to be the fact of the market reacts to incentives. And so when people say we want solutions to these things, they say we want cleaner engines, we want more green technology and stuff, a lot of the innovation for that is not going to come from the government. A lot of the innovation for that, if people are serious about it, is going to come from the private sector. The private sector created the Industrial Revolution, and the private sector is now also creating a lot of the things for greener technology, right? So moving into the 21st century, we can see that capitalism is not perfect. There are many issues with regard to it, but that actually it's probably the only way that we're going to be able to get out of the current crisis, the current difficulties that we're facing at the moment. The innovative nature of it, the unleashing of creativity, is something which can't really be rivaled by any other system that we know of so far. Yes, there are ways in which we can make it more equal. Yes, we can make it in ways which are less harmful to the environment and to our fellow man. But at the same time, it's a recognition that capitalism is not going anywhere, and that its history, although relatively shorter than one might have expected before watching this video, its history has led us to the point at which we are now, and without it, I wouldn't be here talking to you. So, with that being said, have a great day, and see you in the next video. Bye.